Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another episode of Sustainable or Cap. Sustainable or Cap. Where I, your host, Diana Georges, unpack what's really going on behind the scenes of a seemingly sustainable practice. Today we'll be talking about thrifting! But before we get into the good stuff, let's take a moment to get on the same page. What do we mean when we say sustainable? As your humble host, this is what I can offer. Sustainability is rooted in breaking out of the constructed categories of ecology, economy, and society. Human beings and all of our practices and institutions exist in relation to all the other organisms and systems of the planet. Sustainability, therefore, is a deep respect for the interconnectedness of the world and a constant negotiation between individual and community needs of the present and the future. But that is so abstract. What does this form of sustainability actually mean in practice? Well, I love me some guiding questions, so here are a few to help us. 1. How does this practice fit into existing systems of power, such as capitalism, white supremacy, and colonialism? And how do they perpetuate or mitigate those systems? 2. Are our practices accessible to the most marginalized people? 3. How will this practice affect the non-human organisms or systems that we exist in relation to? 4. How long can this practice be done before it no longer positively fits into our definition of sustainability? And 5. How does this practice perpetuate or ripple out violence? Okay, now that we're speaking the same language, let's get back to secondhand clothing. I've noticed that in the last few years, secondhand clothes have blown up in popularity, especially with young people. Honestly, it makes sense. Thrifting can be an affordable, ethical, and fun way to have new clothing. According to ThredUp, an online resale service, in 2020, 42% of thrifted clothes were bought by Gen Zers. That makes total sense. To start, we're going to talk to our field correspondent, Anayad. Anayad, tell us what the kids are saying. So Diana, first we'll be talking to Hank, and now excuse the audio, it was quite windy in London. Hello folks, so we're out here today with Hank. So Hank, thank you for talking to us.
It's a pleasure, and
Of course. So can you just tell me a little bit, why do you like to thrift?
I like to thrift, one, because I'm very poor, I don't have a lot of money, I'm broke, and then also because you just find really interesting pieces that you don't see normally, and it's also cheaper, and that's my thing. You add a nice story to it,
Yeah. What do you know about the thrifting industry?
The thrifting industry is a little bit corrupt now, because there's a lot of commercialization. Caters towards the rich people. And so there's a lot of people who go to thrift stores to find interesting pieces, unique pieces, resell them for a much higher price, and fuck everything up for the rest of us.
Oh no.
I'm sorry, Yellow Curse.
Yeah, that's okay.
My apologies. I feel like that's a big problem, and corporations like Goodwill and stuff, which are not for the people, really raise the prices because there's a higher demand for thrifted clothes.
Interesting take. Thank you so much. Are you wearing anything thrifted right now?
Yeah, my shirt.
Oh, it looks wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, thanks for talking to you, Hank.
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure.
Next up, I'm out here with Mohammed. Mohammed, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, my first question for you is, are you wearing anything thrifted right now?
I am not, but I do own some thrifted items.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you thrift?
Usually, to be honest, I was one of those people who thrifted because they thought it was sustainable. But also, when I started thrifting, I started finding items that you can't really find in stores anymore in terms of quality and designs.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you know about the thrifting industry?
I come from a country or culture that where thrifting is not mainstream. So to be honest, I don't know a lot. But yeah, as I mentioned before, I think it's a sustainable way of buying clothes because you're buying secondhand and you're not adding any extra clothing items to the world.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Muhammad. I hope you have a great day.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, Diana, it sounds like young people appreciate the affordability, upcycling, and fresh fit that thrifting provides. Okay, thank you, Anaya. That makes total sense. So, beloved audience, it's time to introduce you to our special guest, an expert in the U.S. clothing resale industry, Benjamin Cortez. Thank you so much for being here, Benjamin.
It's my pleasure. I'm always ready to talk about what's really going on behind the scenes.
Oh, I'm so excited to get into the details. Thrifting is one of my favorite ways of getting new clothes, and part of it is that I don't feel guilty using something that someone else was done with. But do you think that's a naive belief?
I'm sorry to say that is a naive belief, and I get it. When we think about solving climate change, the solutions that come to our minds are usually individual actions, like recycling and shorter showers. Thrifting just becomes one more way that woke individuals can lessen their carbon footprint. But it's the system of clothing consumption, and consumption in general, that is flawed and needs changing in order to address climate change and social inequality. Individual action will never be enough.
Can you tell us a bit about how the thrifting market works?
Absolutely. I like to do this with the mental image of you donating a bag of your old clothes to Goodwill or Salvation Army. Those are the most well-known large secondhand organizations. It feels good to drop off that bag, but you likely assume that it will be cleaned and resold at the same store or close by. In fact, of the donations they receive, less than half will actually be resold in store. The rest will be recycled or shipped overseas.
Wait a second. Less than half of the clothing is actually resold? And who are we sending our clothes to?
Yes, the public has the perception that when they donate to charity, their items are directly given to those who need them. But that's a little too romantic for our world. The clothing that gets sent abroad ends up in developing countries where it stifles the local economy because they cannot compete with the steady and cheap apparel coming from the West. The top countries the West exported to, as of 2014, were Poland, Ghana, Pakistan, Ukraine, and Benin. On top of that, the clothing itself can be in bad condition as it was not quality enough to be resold in the first place. It often doesn't match the cultural style or body shapes of where it's going, which is dehumanizing to the people who must wear it. Instead of being sustainable, in this way, secondhand clothing actually perpetuates inequality between the global North and South by creating a dependence on the fashion waste and overproduction of the West.
I'm really shocked, Benjamin. I never would have thought that something as benign as donating and then buying secondhand can be so harmful. We've talked about the global impact, but can you talk about the local impacts of thrifting?
Of course. So in the US, that same bag of clothes that you donated does have some positive impacts. For example, organizations like Goodwill use the profit from the clothing they sell to fund programs like skill training for their employees and local community. However, just because these are nonprofits doesn't mean that they don't contribute to inequality as well. For example, in how they pay their executives much more than their regular employees.
I suppose that is also what makes nonprofits still a part of the capitalist system. While they technically cannot save all of the profits, cannot save all of the profit for themselves, the executives and managers can choose how much to reinvest or give as bonuses to themselves, which also reminds me of gentrification within the thrifting world, as thrifting has become more common among young people.
Yes, I agree. While for low-income people, thrifting has long been either the only or most affordable way to get clothing. With the rise of interest by wealthier people, however, thrift stores know that there will still be customers even if prices increase. This manifests in websites like Depop that mark up thrifted clothing for resale, and in having more competition in thrift stores, which both limit the accessibility of thrifting to those who rely on it the most. Also, if there is an increased demand for thrifted clothing, then there must be an increased supply. Where is that clothing coming from, if not the same place as fast fashion? Especially because most people still want to thrift hip clothing.
So are you saying that thrifting, as it stands, doesn't actually contribute to the understanding of sustainability that we stated at the beginning of the show, which, just to reiterate, is the practice of seeing humans in respectful relation to other life?
Well, yes and no. While thrifting can still make it easier for low-income people to get clothing, and it does keep articles in circulation longer, The benefits are mostly individual, but the problems of the global fashion industry are systemic. More and more clothing is created and put into the circulation. The excess that doesn't make it into the US secondhand market is then sent abroad or it's recycled. Thrifting does not reduce the unethical working conditions, toxic production methods, and pollution of the fast fashion industry. It just gives it another life. Further, pretending that thrifting is an ethical form of consumption means that we can never question the assumption that we can get new clothes whenever possible. The overproduction and overconsumption that are drivers of climate change go unchallenged.
Now we're getting to the good stuff, Benjamin. I'd love to talk about solutions and moving us forward, because as you said, thrifting doesn't actually solve the systemic problems in the fast fashion industry. We talk a lot on Sustainable or CAP about how a fundamental aspect of responding to climate change justly is by localizing systems of production and consumption, which simply means that more of the things that people need are produced close to where they will be consumed. The distance that our clothing travels, even if it's thrifted, is huge. Imagine if we adapted to a system similar to pre-industrialization, in which clothing is custom-made and long-lasting.
That's a wonderful concept, Diana, and I agree. Unfortunately, that infrastructure doesn't exist at the moment. I think it's helpful to get into some abstract economic theory.
Riveting stuff.
It certainly is, to understand the transition that needs to happen to get to this beautiful vision of sustainability.
Well, if you're going to give compliments like that, then we can certainly talk about economic theory.
Of course.
So the principle behind capitalism is the accumulation of wealth. Therefore, for the capitalist, commodities are seen as a way to make profit. If capitalism is a machine, then this is what the capitalist does. They put money in, get a commodity, then sell that commodity to make more money.
That makes sense. So instead of the end game being subsistence or life-improving commodities, the end game is capital, which, and I'm just thinking out loud for a minute, if we see the secondhand market as all the usable waste of the fashion industry, then what happens with that waste is actually split into capitalist and non-capitalist enterprises. Because instead of being designed to make sure everyone can have affordable, quality clothing, the recycling and selling abroad part of the system is designed to produce capital. So, although there is the nonprofit part, of which we discussed it has its own problems, what behind the scenes actually shows us is that thrifting is not the benign, charitable act that we believed it to be.
I think, and this ties into what you said about localized systems, that we need to change the end game of capital to one of subsistence. Instead of putting money in to ultimately get more money, we can make our end goal commodities. Of course, this has to be done through a lens of sustainability and equity.
When people hear subsistence, I think they often assume it means living less fully. But what I hear you saying is that it's actually about living intentionally.
Precisely. Where is our clothing coming from? Is it made to last? Where does it go when we're done with it? You mentioned developing a system similar to pre-industrialization, one in which clothing is custom-made and long-lasting. What if more people know how to make and repair their own clothing? I believe that subsistence, making more of what you need, is as equally full as our current consumption-based lifestyle.
And of course, it's key that we make sure it's not just a gentrified version of subsistence either.
Of course, equity is sexy, as they say.
Well, Benjamin, it has truly been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for all of your wisdom.
No problem, thank you.
Well, dear listeners, there you have it. It turns out that thrifting is cap. I suppose the more you know, the more you're disappointed. But don't think we'll leave you without a few action items to take with you. Action items! 1. If you can afford to buy handmade clothing, go for it. 2. Understand that thrifting does not mean guilt-free, unlimited consumption, but rather practice moderation and take care of the items you have. 3. Trade with friends before donating. 4. Consider learning new skills, such as sewing, knitting, patchwork, or upcycling, to be better able to update your own clothing before letting it go. Well, folks, that's all we have for you today. I'd like to thank our guest, Benjamin Cortez, and our field correspondent, Anayed. Keep it fresh and take it easy, beloved listeners.